I'm Richie Dahoff. I'm the interviewer.
I'm Scott Estrada, a note taker.
Dylan Karlovich, a note taker.
And Angel Velez is our cameraman. We are interviewing George Martin on December 4th at Marquette University High School.
All right, so we are here with George Martin. First of all, can you describe your parents' background before you were born?
Well, my dad was a Milwaukee guy. He went to North Division in high school. And I'm a love child of World War II, and very proud to say that. My mother was a Filipino teenager, and my parents were both teenagers in that war, as my dad served the U.S. Army. And so they met, 16 she was, and he was 18 and a half, and it presented those kinds of things. And there's a long story in terms of, and I'll make it short. During wartime, U.S. soldiers had to get permission from the military to marry. And the Philippines was a quasi-Catholic country based upon colonization by the Spaniards. So my parents were never alone. There was always a family member in the room or wherever. And they sought to get married. And the reason why the military approved it was because so that a GI would not have a wife in the States and then marry somebody else in Europe or somebody else in the Philippines. So, but they were denied twice to get married. And then the third time, my dad explained that he went to Catholic schools. And because they thought, well, every black person is Baptist or Methodist. And he explained that, and they finally got approval to get married, and I was conceived. Yeah. And I spent about, a couple months in the Philippines until arrangements were made for my mother and I to come to the United States. Yeah.
So what do you recall about your family life in the Philippine Islands?
Well, very little. I was a month and a half old. And also what I recall is what I was told, and one of the things about war is that unless you've had it in your own backyard, you don't have the sense of the violence and the loss. So my mother lost most of her family, literally. And there were difficulties there in between who's ever invading a country, and for the Filipinos at that time, it was not only the Japanese, but it was the U.S. So there were two armed forces to be scared of. But fortunately we came, and my mother, at 17, left her whole culture, left everybody she knew, and her and I were on a boat crossing the Pacific Ocean for a month and a half, and so we had a real special bond beyond my other 9 brothers and sisters. Yeah.
Yeah, so you say you have 9 other brothers and sisters.
Yeah.
Tell me about your experience growing up with that many siblings.
Well, with 9 brothers and sisters, my mother blamed the Pope for that because you weren't supposed to do birth control. But, we're a poor family. My dad always worked 2 full-time jobs, and for many years didn't have a car. So. And me, as the oldest, I had a huge responsibility, but my closest to my mother was really important. I always worked. I worked part-time in grade school. I worked part-time in high school. I worked full-time in college. But that was just the nature of it, coming from a larger family. But, and not a but, there's a lot of joy and a lot of love. And it's transferring responsibilities down, and so with more kids, there's more people to do things. But as I got older and athletic, I was a competitive swimmer at 7 years old, and very much into sports and working. So as I got older and came to Marquette High, actually my brother underneath me, we moved away from the house because there were so many kids and wasn't a lot of quiet space to study, and we moved into an apartment above my dad's shop. He was an upholsterer and next to my grandmother. So I kind of left earlier, and those stair steps, the age between the children got a little bit longer. So I really didn't grow up with some of my younger brothers and sisters.
So could you describe some of the jobs you had, like in grade school? Or?
Oh yeah, in grade school. I'll tell you, you know, to me, one of the important things beyond my education was the boys' club. And back then it was only for boys, and there was only one in town over off Brady Street. It was a great organization. They had everything you could think of. And so that's where I spent my time. And then at about eight or nine, I started working in the candy store at the boys' club and selling potato chips. But that's kind of how that went. But the boys' club was really important for me, not only in terms of sports, but in terms of study, in a lot of other things in life. Yeah.
So when did your family decide to move to Milwaukee, and why?
Well, when my mother and I came from the Philippines, we joined my father at different military bases till his term was up. And we ended up in Chicago with other relatives and my dad. And he came from Milwaukee, graduated from North Division. And at that time, Milwaukee Area Technical College, which was called Milwaukee Vocational School, was the best vocational school in all of the United States. So he was anxious to get back home and study upholstery and wood refinishing. And so that's what brought us to Milwaukee.
How was your grade school education at St. Boniface?
Well, it was a world, and you know, as we talk about the problems of today in race and the issues, back then it was a different world. You know, and I'm talking about the late 50s. There were lots of jobs. Somebody could drop out of high school and get a $20 hour job, union job that afternoon. And there was honor and dignity in it. So, you know, there wasn't a lot of squabble about economics. And it was kind of like Happy Days, and you might know that Happy Days was based upon Milwaukee, but some police officers called you by name. It wasn't a lot of hassle. There was some negativity in some aspects, but it was really neighborhood oriented and very integrated in terms of where I grew up. So to me, those are all good memories.
Could you describe how living on the military bases were?
Well, I was so young then. And so by the time we got off the military bases, I was maybe 3 years old or 2 years old, probably 2 years old.
Did your mother tell you anything about how that was like?
Well, it was all difficult for her because she was in a whole new world. And the only ones she knew were my dad and me. And she didn't have other children until we moved back to the Midwest in Chicago and Milwaukee, Chicago briefly. So it was quite difficult for her. And at the same time, in coming from a tropical island, she got serious illnesses right away. And she was very, very asthmatic. And I'm asthmatic too, but she had health difficulties, so it was always trying times for her. And I just lost her this January, and she was 89, and I think of her often.
How was your 4-year Marquette High School experience?
Well, I'll tell you, I remember in grade school, Sister Rebecca, you know, working on my dad and saying he ought to go to Marquette High. I didn't know Marquette High. You know, we came from a parish that didn't. There were 3 guys from my parish who were in the class ahead of me. But before then, no one from the parish went to Marquette High. And so the experience of taking an entrance exam, and then because of being lower on the score and being asked to go to summer school, and I never got less than a B. In grade school, it's like, what is this about? I don't want to do that. So, but once into the regiment here, you know, I appreciated it. It was hard. It was very hard. I started in the 7th class. I worked my way up to the 3rd class. I caught the bus to school and back, and I played sports year-round, and I worked. So it was a hard and difficult time, but at the same time, I have enduring friendships that go way back, especially in my homeroom. Yeah.
What homeroom did you belong to?
Huh?
What homeroom did you
Oh, I
belong
don't remember. Geez, how long? What? That was 53 years ago when I graduated. Yeah, but the Maronis, the Knackards, you know, people continued to be friends throughout my life. Yeah.
What area were you living in Milwaukee around your childhood?
Well, I grew up out of St. Boniface, which was basically about 12th and Center Street. And earlier than that, St. Francis, when we first moved here. And I still do a lot of work at St. Francis on King's Holiday, which I'll talk about later, because that's going to be a commercial. But you know, St. Boniface was a very integrated school, and it was in a working class neighborhood, and it was German and Polish and Jewish and Puerto Rican and black, and so I came up in that kind of diversity, and at a time when things were pretty well off economically, except for some police issues, and a chief we had called Pryor back then.
Could you describe what the issues were?
Well, I work on police accountability now, and the issues were racial, and the issues were prejudicial. They were about unjustly stopping people, and also an unfair court system in a lot of respects. And you know, that's been realized over time, and we still continue to have some of the police race issues that we had back then. And maybe in some respects, you know, the FBI came out a couple years ago and said, quite frankly, that race issues and deaths were just as high as back into slavery in the Civil War days, and it was just hidden more. And so, anyways, that tent of Milwaukee has always been there, and I work in police accountability, and I lecture at universities, and I work with the powers to be to help make things better here.
At the age of 16, you said you participated in the Great March on Washington.
Yes.
Could you go into greater detail on what that was like?
Well, I do, and I love telling this story. But I want to first begin, as we talk about civil rights, I want to acknowledge other Marquette High family. And that's Judge Leander Foley and Judge William Cannon, in terms of their work in desegregating the Eagles Club. And I'll come back to that a little bit later on. But, you know, I'm 16, it was August 23rd, I think, right before the semester was starting. And Father Grappi, the famous civil rights speech priest, I came home from working at the Boys Club, and he was parked in front of the house. And quite frankly, I had quit talking to Father Grappi a number of years earlier because of some things which I'll explain. So I was surprised to see him. And I was formerly his altar boy, one of his altar boys. And my mom saying, "Don't say a word, come get your bag, you're going with him." And I didn't know what was happening. And she had packed my Marquette High gym bag with a couple of sandwiches and a change of clothes. And off we went with some guys, people from the parish. And once we got on the highway, I found out that we were going to Washington, D.C. I didn't know it. It was a complete surprise. And then we were going to the Great March on Washington. And so it was pretty overwhelming. We drove all night. I remember waking up in the morning shivering, and we actually had got there and laid down with some newspaper to cover us up to get to sleep. And when I woke up, I realized that we were on the banks of the Potomac River, and it was really cold. But that began the day. And I'll tell you, it was an amazing day. It was an amazing day in terms of beginning to walk toward the mall. And hundreds and thousands of people all going in that same direction. And all kinds of people, young and old, different races. You know, and as a 16-year-old kid, it was like, wow, look at all these girls. All these girls of different colors and different tints, and all these beautiful people. And there's an amazing sense to this kind of gathering. You know, it's like being at a football game, Packer game, and everybody's rooting for the Packers. Everybody wants the same thing, you know. And it's this kind of moving. And so as we walked to the mall, I came upon a big stage. And it was the first real concert I had really outseen, probably one of the first significant outdoor concerts. And it was Pete Seeger, who's passed away. I was at his 92nd birthday party in New York City. Peter, Paul, and Mary, and probably names a lot of people, younger people don't know. Mahalia Jackson, and a lot of other, and it was just wonderful. So hey, I'm this 16-year-old kid, you know, and I got lost from the group, and I'm in heaven. I'm just wandering around, and then after the concert, I walked over to the reflecting pond in front of the Lincoln Monument, and I took off my shoes and I was cooling it off, and I looked up on the Lincoln Monument, and there are people starting to gather, and there was some scaffolding over to the right of the microphone, and not really knowing what was happening or when things were happening, I went up there and had this great view of 200,000 people coming together from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And it got crowded, and the program started. And I was about 10 feet from the microphone on my right. And I remember getting brushed over. And I looked, and there were some black men with white military hats on and white, and they were the Muslims who were guarding Dr. King. And I always thought back, and I had hoped that maybe it was Dr. King who bumped into me too. And the program started, and many fabulous speakers. And when King started, he started his speech. And over his shoulder was Mahalia Jackson, the famous gospel singer who was performed in the concert. And as King started his speech, and a lot of people don't know this, Mahalia kept interrupting him. And she would say, "Martin, tell him about your dream." Because Dr. King didn't plan on giving that speech, but he gave it the week before in Detroit. And King was like, you know, and he continued on, Mahalia, "Martin, you got to tell him about your dream." He finally broke in, and he gave his I Have a Dream speech about all God's children. And it was certainly stirring, beyond a doubt. And real significant to me, being that close. And I think it's been instrumental in my life, having been that close and looking at hundreds of thousands of people in the process. I don't think that I could do what I do today if I had not been there. And so we came back to Milwaukee, and we started the Catholic High Schools Interracial Council. And we met with representatives of all the schools around race, around diversity, and it was an important thing to do at that time. And so that was a direct offshoot of that. But my work in civil rights didn't begin then. It began my freshman year at 14. And I was a whole 123 pounds, and I got cut from the freshman football team, and it broke my heart. And someone said, "Well, the swimming team's starting up." And I went and saw the coach, and he said, "Well, yeah, we got our first meet. It's a citywide meet by age." And I had never been to a practice, so it didn't matter. He said, "Yeah, come join us." So I went to that meet, and I won 9 medals. So it was a good time, and I was all hopped up and ready for things. And then that Monday morning after that meet, before school in the workout room lifting weights, in came Judges Foley and Cannon. And they said, you know, "George, we want to talk to you. You probably don't know this, but we don't have a swimming pool in Marquette High. And we practice at the Eagles Club. And the Eagles Club is whites only membership. And your father can't join. And under normal circumstances, you wouldn't be able to practice with your team." So it's like, pow. But then they explained that they had been working to desegregate the Eagles Club for years nationally. And that they always were confronted with the issue, if you have blacks in the club, you're going to have problems. So Judges Foley and Cannon handed me their membership cards as past presidents of the Milwaukee Eagles Club and said, "We want you to go, and we want you to practice with the team. And when the convention comes around in a couple years, it'll be in Milwaukee. and we'll be able to say that we've had a black in our club for a couple years. There have been no problems, and we think we can get the membership to vote to desegregate. And so that was the mission at that time. But it went, you know, it wasn't like this conscious trying to do something. It was just being part of the team and part of the school. Then a couple years later, well, no, it was that year. Father James Gruppy was having dinner at my family's house on a Sunday afternoon, and we were talking about things, and he brought up that they were going to demonstrate at the Eagles Club when the convention came to town. And I said, you know, I explained to him what was happening and that I was going and working with judges Foley and Cannon. And he was irascible. He's the most significant civil rights person in the state, but he was irascible. And he wouldn't accept that. And we argued over my parents' dinner table. I'm 14 years old, but we argued about that. And he decided they were going to do it. He went his way, and I quit talking to him for a couple of years. But I just want to mention that. And as an activist and someone who trains in civil disobedience and someone who's very much about a lot of things, I was always against demonstrations at people's homes. And I didn't know at the time, because I'm working full time, I'm, you know, doing what I'm doing. But these judges were being demonstrated against for being part of the Eagles Club. And that was entirely wrong, because they were in fact leading to desegregate the Eagles Club for many years. So I just want to tell that side of the story, and it's a real important side of the story. So, you know, that was the experience in terms of those days in high school. And it was a wonderful experience. And I had experiences with Dr. King later on. But it was real significant in terms of what formed me.
Okay, so after high school, you said you were confronted about the military draft. Could you explain that?
Well, I was drafted out of Marquette University, and I was in good standing and shouldn't have been drafted. And I'm not one who calls the race card often, but I've learned to understand things as I grow older. And so the university said, well, you're good standing, it's the draft board. And I called a meeting. I had a friend who worked at the draft board, and went down and met with the draft board manager. And I had a friend from one of my business classes who was also drafted and shouldn't have been and was in good standing. So we met with the draft board manager. And the draft board manager ultimately turned to my friend, who was white, and said to him, what zip code do you live in? And he gave him a suburban zip code in Wauwatosa. And the draft board manager said, well, you don't have to go. And he turned to me and said, what zip code do you live in? And I gave him 53212 Center Street. He said, you get on the bus Monday morning. I straight out responded to him with, Chuck you. And I didn't go. And, you know, when that kind of racism just hits you right in the face, and I'm a kid who's in Happy Land, you know, and it's like, what? Come on, you know? So that was a real kind of turning point in my life. I refused to go to the war. I was raised military, but I was also raised by parents who made a distinction about what was right and wrong. And I was supposed to get on the bus Monday morning. Sunday night at midnight, I went out running with a friend driving my car behind me, and ran myself into an asthma attack and crawled into the hospital. And I was on the hospital bed when I was supposed to be on the bus. So they changed my status. But that was a real awakening. And it also was an awakening that kind of took me out of my university. And so that kind of changed my life in a lot of different ways. Yeah.
And what did you go on doing after that?
Well, I was the youngest original Black Panther in Milwaukee. And This was before the days of Michael McGee and people who might be recognized that way. And it was a real chilling experience. I went to work on the war on poverty, and most of us worked in the community. And so that was my entree to the community. And I worked in job development. I began to be involved in community boards. By the time I was 22, I was on 9 community boards. And I was always the youngest guy. And, community boards around healthcare, around physical development, around jobs, around computer programming and educating students back then. But that was my real education, was working in the community. And later on, I went back to school. Yeah.
Could you recall from detail all 9 of the organizations you belonged to?
Oh, gee. There was a housing corporation to build and rehab housing. There was a community credit union. There was a community development corporation about how physically the community evolves. I was on the board of a job placement organization. I was on the board of a healthcare organization. So it just kind of, all these kind of things kind of fit, and that was part of Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty.
Can you go into detail about your experience of being a Black Panther?
Well, it was a short time. It was a short time. And it was also a time of, at that time we had a police chief called Harold Breyer. We had a couple judges who were just the stories that we could tell about the prejudice, about police violence. And they're similar to stories of today. And it's just continued down that road. I remember when I was working in job placement and working with people, and one of my clients I'd get a message that he was in jail. And so I'd go down to court with him, and it would be for very little of anything other than being black and walking down the street and then getting harassed. And it was a judge at that time named Judge Seraphin. And as an advocate, I would be there trying to assist. And Judge Seraphin would say to the bailiff, "How many pigeons are there on the windowsill?" And the bailiff would say 4. And the judge would go, 4 years. That's the kind of atmosphere that we had. And I don't want this all to be about police accountability, but that's a problem that we deal with today, and it has continued. But also that has a future in terms of the kinds of things that can be, especially in terms of community control and true policing. So this is something that I lecture on. And work with the ACLU on and other organizations in terms of improving the situation.
Can you recall any specific events regarding racial prejudice?
Well, I'll tell you, we can talk about a lot of them. But I remember this story about this guy was a corporate executive, black guy. And he had an afro out to here, but well-dressed company car. And he was going to a meeting in Chicago, and was pulling into the the toll station, and was in the thick of a bunch of cars. It was like noon. It was heavy traffic, and out of nowhere, this Illinois state trooper singles him out and pulls him over. And the guy said, "Officer, what is it?" And he said, "Well, you were speeding." And the guy said, "Well, I'm with all the traffic here. We're all going the same thing, And the guy says, "Well, you're 6 miles over the limit." And he said to the black guy, he said, do you have a bond card?" Which is a AAA card, which would mean that if you were arrested, that card would serve as your bond. And I said, "No." And he said, not me, but the guy said, and the officer said, "Well, this is a $150 fine for going 6-7 miles over the speed limit." And I said, "I got $100. He said, "Well, I'm arresting you and taking you to jail." And this guy was me. So he puts me in the front of the squad car, gets in on the other side, takes a shotgun, cocks it, puts it in my side, and drives down the highway at 100 miles an hour. And I'm saying, you really don't have to do this. But that was his racism. You know? And I got arrested, went to jail, called a friend, brought $50, and I was out of there. But that was totally unnecessary. And people say, well, why did he do it? He did it because he could do it. And I just want to end this with, there are a lot of good officers, and there are some bad officers. But that was a really direct experience for me personally.
Could you go into further detail on what your relationship with Martin Luther King was like?
Well, sure, yeah. As the youngest Black Panther at the time, the Democratic Party, which helped push the March on Washington, promote it, and otherwise, when Dr. King moved from civil rights and voting rights to begin to talk about economics, there was a rebuke. And Lyndon Johnson, literally President Johnson at the time, because of Kennedy's assassination. Oh, and I remember Kennedy's assassination. I was working in the cafeteria right here when it came over the radio. And most people at that time can remember when and where they were. And I was handing out milk in the cafeteria at lunch when that announcement was made. So was Lyndon Johnson. And Lyndon Johnson in really rebuked King in terms of wanting to move into other areas of justice. And also being against the war in Vietnam. And so King moved to campaign for Hubert Humphrey out of Minnesota. And so he was campaigning with Humphrey, and Humphrey was coming through Milwaukee. And they made a campaign stop at a small black church up on Green Bay Avenue. And we as Black Panthers provided security for King at that time. And I got to have a bit of a conversation with him. And really significantly in terms of what happened in the later years. And I have a political theater group. And we've written plays about King's last year. And King's last year was April 4th to April 4th. And April 4th, he gave his famous Riverside Speech Church, where he came out against the Vietnam War, in militarism and racism and materialism. And when he did that, his organization was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. They rebuked him because their position was, well, this ought to be about civil rights. What are you talking about war? What are you talking about materialism for? And, you know, it was a difficult time for him. And then through that year, as he began more about economics, April 4th was the day that he was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. And he was there working with the Garbage Workers Union to help them negotiate and get a better life. So that was a tough year, and there's a significance to that in terms of where we stand now. But I've got to know and understand him through my work more. And for the last 17 years at St. Francis Church, which is where the civil rights movement really started in Milwaukee, over on 4th and Brown, we've had a celebration of King, not around the fluffy stuff, but around social and economic justice. And we've done this for 17 years. And we recognize the groups in the community who follow his value and his lead in working in the community. And we have culture and program. And then we march to his statue. And at the statue we have open mic, which I love. And anybody can speak about how they felt about King, about nonviolence, or how they feel about anything that's happening in the community. So we have the young to the old, and it's just a really, really important time for people to express themselves. So we've been doing this for 17 years. On his birthday, on the first Monday there, I don't know what day it is this year, it might be the 15th of January, I think. But at 1 o'clock, we'll have our program at St. Francis Church. Yeah.
So would you say that Martin Luther King was your main role model
Well, absolutely, absolutely. Especially, I'm very fortunate. You know, and I am mixed, but coming up in America, I'm black. And that's how I came up. So when I was in grade school, I saw pictures of black people getting lynched. I saw the worst. And so as we went through the civil rights movement, being a part of that, then there was the revolutions or the changes at the universities led by students. That was part of my life. Then there was the women's movement. Then there was the LGBT movement. So having lived through all of that, I feel so much richer in understanding humanity. And that's all a big part of me. And it's come to the conclusion today that, my friends on the social side say when George was on the dark side, meaning when I was on corporate side. And, you get a lot of things done. I had my own businesses. I worked for the third largest corporate promotions company. I spun out. I had multi-million-dollar business, 15 employees. My clients were Michael Jackson, the NBA, the NFL, Pepsi-Cola, top clients in the country. And I had a darn good time at that. And that was fun stuff. But ultimately, I came back to the community. Yeah.
So what made you make the switch from corporate to community?
Well, different things happen. Early on, it was about Watergate. And I was part of a organization, community-based organization that worked in healthcare and developed one of the initial models of HMOs, health maintenance organizations. This was back in the 70s. And we were one of the 4 national models of the Department of Health. And I was traveling around helping set up HMOs in communities of color around the country, very specifically. And Watergate came down and froze things up. And that pushed me back into the corporate world. But later on, just in terms of needs in here in our community, I've worked with homelessness here in Milwaukee for 28 years. And I continue to do that as a volunteer in an organization that I'm a part of. Yeah. So, but it's kind of this people kind of thing. And this people kind of thing hit me my junior year at Marquette High in a history class. And I remember up in the upper right side of the book was a cartoon of Teddy Roosevelt stepping over a mountain in Cuba with a big club saying, "Walk gently and carry a big stick." And I'm saying to myself, who are we to be telling people in other countries how they should live and what they should do, And so there's a lot of, that's kind of how I began feeling that way in terms of things. And so as things evolved, and I wasn't part of the peace movement until 2000. I really wasn't. And I was pulled into that. But it to me, it's really important, and that's been my focus since 2000. And now that I'm older and retired, I work harder than ever, and I pick and choose my own battles. And significantly, I have some leverage, and so I get around. Yeah.
Can you go into detail about your experience in the dark side? Any major events?
Oh, well, sure. I mean, I was young, but I was bright thanks to Marquette High, and I was a good problem solver, and I was very creative. So when I worked for the pharmaceutical companies, and it was pharmaceuticals. I produced television commercials at 26 years old. I produced radio. I opened accounts around the country, and I also managed clients. I did a lot of different things, but I left that area because of what I saw that the corporation I worked for was doing in Africa in testing products and hurting people, literally hurting people. And there's, when you test products here in the United States, you work with prisons, you work with the Federal Drug Administration, you do it ethically, you know. But my supervisor at the time was doing things unethically, and I rebuked it. Yeah.
So what was it like to be the U.S. market manager for the world's largest pharmaceutical company?
Oh, it was pretty much fun. Yeah, it was fun. It was, you know, being able to be creative, and at the same time to really move around the country, and create new products. And creating new products. I was working with my research outside London, and then my finance was in Melbourne, Australia, and I'd be up at 4 in the morning on a telex machine, and most people don't know what a telex machine is. That was before the internet. And so it was a little keypad that went over the telephone line and came out on the other end in Australia, wherever you were working with. And so that's how I communicated, you know, with my financial structure. And so it was a different world. You know, I moved from Milwaukee, moved out to Connecticut to be close to Madison Avenue and the advertisers, and it was fun stuff. It was fun stuff.
Did you ever participate in any of the Milwaukee marches?
No, I didn't. No, I didn't, because that was corresponding to the time that I was drafted out of school. And it was also corresponding to the time that I didn't get along with Father Gruppy. Yeah. So in fact, I didn't do that. I had a lot of friends who did, but at the same time, I was kind of into a different segment of things.
So you just stayed home and
Well,
ignored
no.
Father Gruppy?
No, I didn't stay home. I worked full time. I went to school full time. You know, most people, if you're going to college full time and working full time, that's a heck of a lot. Okay, and so it wasn't just my attitude about Father Gruppy, but there's lots of stuff going on. And at the same time, I was doing some positive stuff. Yeah.
What do you recall about the city of Milwaukee at that time? Was it in unrest or?
Oh, it was so segregated. You know, that was the significance of the marches across the bridge. There was a lot accomplished during that time. And also during that time, I was working on what's called the racial sensitivity end. I was working with corporations and employers in terms of understanding race and managing race and getting employees with good retention in how to handle those things. And I was working more with corporate Milwaukee in terms of helping make those kind of positive economic transitions.
Could you describe the organization that you led, which was against the Iraq War?
Well, to try to stop it from starting in 2002, I went to Chicago to a mass meeting to create this organization. It was called United for Peace and Justice, and 1,400 organizations across the country. And I co-chaired that for 8 years. 2 days after shock and awe, I was in Baghdad on a fact-finding mission. And so to be able to tell the personal stories and educate people, and I'll tell you that I can cry very easily. But I remember one evening, and we got around, you know, and it was a war zone, but we got around. And we were in a coffee shop talking late at night, and our interpreter said, well, you have to go meet this family. And it was 10 o'clock at night. Oh, please, they want you to come. And so we went to their home. And with the bombing and shock and awe, really reduced the housing stock. And so families were doubled and tripled and quadrupled up, literally. And so there were like 29 people living in this apartment. And they wanted us to hear their story. And their story was that, and we went. And kind of being the oldest, the family focused on me. And there were 12 of us from across the country. And Mama started telling the story that when the war broke out, her son just graduated from high school. And there were no jobs. And so he went to Jordan to get work. And he was successful. And he had come home to find a bride. He had a job in another country, you know, and he came home to find a bride. And his mom had him go to his dad's shop, which was about 8 or 9 blocks away, to tell his dad to come home for lunch. But he never came home, and the kid never got to the shop. So Mom and Grandma went out looking for him because there were disturbances in the neighborhood and things happening. And I want to say this right away, okay, in terms of our U.S. military. We have many wonderful people. And war is such that it makes good people do bad things. That's what war is about, you know. And so the kid never came back, and Mom and Grandma went out to look for him, and they're searching for him. And they see him over on the other side of the street, laying in the gutter. They recognized his high school jacket. It had white sleeves and blue, and it was all bloody. And they were horrified. And as they were standing there in their grief, some of our military walked up, and one of our women soldiers took out a pistol and shot him in the head 3 times, and he was already dead. Imagine how a mother would feel, a grandmother would feel seeing that, you know? And they're telling us this story, and Mom's holding his high school jacket, his bloody jacket, and Grandma is on her knees crying on my lap. Now, what do you say? And Mom came right out and said, we don't hate you. We don't hate Americans. We understand the difference of war and greed and the need to be here and take our oil. But we don't hate you, you know. We understand that's politics and government. But what we do ask is that you go home and tell the truth. And so that's what I've been about when it comes to war or climate or things that impact, you know, upon what's fair and right and just. Yeah. So that organization, 8 years, I co-chaired that. Big part of my life. Volunteer. My money, you know. And office in Washington, in New York, staff of about 10. And I'm working back and forth and taking time off from my job. But this is what it's about. But going back to that March on Washington and the 200,000, I've helped organize events on that mall of more than 500,000 4 times. And I could not have done that had I not got the confidence when I was in high school, you know, to be able to do things like that. So it's a rough thing, but what it did do as I worked, I got a big mouth. I like to tell the story that the only class I ever skipped at Marquette High was my speech class in my first speech. And I couldn't get the guts to get up there and talk. So it's a long way that I've come, you know. And I have a skill, and I've learned this skill, but I can talk to 500,000 people, hundreds of thousands of people. And I know how to do that, and I know how to carry it. And so that's a skill that I have to bring to the movements. And with that skill, I've done a lot of international travel and a lot of international work. And you know, there's and also requested to do that. I've worked on all 5 continents. I've worked in 30 countries, many of them repeatedly. I was just in Greece this April, and it's really significant in terms of how the whole world wants the same things. Literally wants the same things. And to be able to explain those things, and to be able to explain economics, to be able to explain the United Nations, And I'm a non-governmental delegate to the United Nations in both nuclear disarmament and climate. And so, but to me, as a skill, to explain politics, to explain economics, is what's really important. And those are skills that I got right here, in terms of my education and my comprehension. So I've had the opportunity to do this. I've been on television in more than 150 countries, hundreds of radio stations. And I still get I do a lot of speaking around the country at universities, and I'll speak at kindergarten classes and talking about the things that we're talking about, but a lot of times talking about King. And so in my work as an international leader in the peace movement, I was requested by Nobel Peace Prize winner Wangari Maathai of Kenya to come and be the motivational speaker. She put together an international youth conference, and she wanted me to come and talk about King in terms of motivation. And that was just something real special. I've got some highlights that, like, I couldn't make up stories, And even in that trip, there's something called a World Social Forum, and it's a venue that I work in. The first time I did it was 2004, southern Brazil. 200,000 people, all non-government, completely non-government, on social issues. And I remember walking into a tent there. And I addressed the largest assembly there. And it was 10,000 people in a tent. And my 20-minute speech from southern Brazil was broadcast in its entirety to the United States by Democracy Now! And that's an important internet-based news service. But to get 20 minutes of airtime was huge, as we were working against what was seemingly a popular war, And I remember coming out of that tent and seeing this guy walking, and he was in full garment and had a big hat on. I never saw his face, but something inside me told me that you know him. And here I am in this country I've never been to, and I went out after him, and without thinking, I hollered, "Baghdad!" He stopped. And he turned around. He was the most significant man that any of us in the peace movement had met and worked with in Iraq. And here we were continents away, and by chance, seeing each other. And he was the headmaster of the old school next to the main mosque in Baghdad. And he was so happy to see me, and I was happy to see him. And we sat down next to the river and exchanged pleasantries and hugs. Then he turned to me and he says, "George, what are you doing in America? Our kids are starving. They're dying. The toll of the war, unbelievable." And it was just such a heavy weight on me, just like it was, in that home with Mom and Grandma. And so that's what drives me. That's what drives me. And so I'm in a very good state in life right now where I can do what I want to do. And so I get around and I can tell the stories. And I'm in demand. I say I got a big mouth. But I think that's real important. And it's real important to make the connections. I remember the fiasco at Wall Street when Wall Street went down, and I was speaking on Wall Street. And I remember one of the sound bites I like to use is that, I was 10 feet from Dr. King when he gave his "I Have a Dream" speech. Today, the problem is that too much of America is still dreaming. And that's the side I work on, And it's so, we can look at ourselves here, and I have been in the worst ghettos in South America. I have been in the worst ghettos in Africa. And at the same time, people all over the world want to be like us, And so, you know, it's tough stuff about war. It's tough stuff about nuclear weapons. On the 50th anniversary of the bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I spoke at Hiroshima and Nagasaki to crowds of 10,000s. And when you experience what a country like that did, and I'm proud, I want to put it this way too, and don't get me wrong, you know, people can see me as an activist or a politician and see me in some ways. But in the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., we work to make America the best that she can be because we love America. So we're working hard, you know. And so with all that's happening in our country, stuff that, you know, when I was 22, I established the first affirmative action program in the state of Wisconsin. Things keep going backwards, you know. You know, when we marched in Washington for greater access to education, Brown versus the Board of Education, the legislation that discriminated, that integrated education has gone backwards. You know, we marched for jobs, and affirmative action is being offset, and it's gone backwards. You know, we should have been marching for health care. The union said they had it covered, but we've never really had health care. You know, before Obamacare, and I'm not a Democrat or a fan of Obamacare, but 47,000 people died in this country because of the lack of health care. And what's happening now, it's going to get worse under this administration and the changes. So it's a continual struggle. And it's one where you kind of get your satisfaction off the little ones to keep the energy to going. So at this point in time, I see my role as an elder. You know, I can do things other people can't do, and I can work at levels other people can't. But I see myself as a trainer and an educator. I'm proud of my relationship with the Marquette University Center for Peacemaking, and I was their first community fellow. And I'm proud of my relationships with students and sharing in terms of how to do things and how to organize. But it's a special time for me right now.
So you said you made 4 speeches at the mall at Washington. Can you describe some of those?
Well, I organized within our organization of 14 organizations around the country. I organized 4 rallies at the mall of more than 500,000 people. And within that, one of them in 2005 began in Europe. And I was at the university. I was invited over to university at the University of Padua, the oldest university in Europe, and we're working on United Nations reform. And I gave a closing speech, and I like to do the drama. So at the close of my speech, I whipped out a peace flag from my back pocket and popped it. And there came a motion from the floor to have an International Day of Action against the Iraq War. And it started in Europe with my speech there. And then I came back to U.S. and organized with my organization, and we had 500,000 in D.C. And we had a concert, 10-hour concert of 200,000 that we put together and organized on that day. And since then, we did many more in D.C. And in my role in terms of my leadership is not only and doing something like that, you take a month, 2 months out of your life, you know, and you go and work on that and work with the authorities and put that together. But my role there has been kind of like I've been the glue, you know, and I've been a spiritual leader within that. And so it's significant in terms of what happens and when, and also the rallies in Europe and other places. So to the issues, all of those were around the Iraq War. And you know, through that, and as activists, our tools are education, they're lobbying, and they're public witness. And public witness is demonstrations, rallies, nonviolent civil disobedience. In the vein of King, in the vein of Jesus, in the vein of Gandhi. And so in more recent years, I've taken leadership in training around civil disobedience. and also teaching and developing groups around that atmosphere of nonviolence and what it really means. And so here, I have trained unions. I've trained teachers. I've trained Occupy movement. I've trained immigration movement here in this state, and continue to do that, and to do it in a way that it's nonviolent, and also that it's secure for the people who are demonstrating to get their message out. And it's a way of getting your message out where it doesn't come before. And I'll use the example, George Bush was visiting. He came to Milwaukee 37 times. I organized 36 demonstrations. And at the one that I didn't organize, the unions organized it. And so my relationships are really important. So I've always had great relationships with the Milwaukee, not always, but over time it's become a really good relationship with previous chiefs in this department. And one of the reasons was that us in the peace movement taking up a responsibility to counter the Nazi and Ku Klux Klan demonstrations that come to Milwaukee. And I could talk about that a lot in terms of organizing against that in a nonviolent manner and working with authorities. When the Nazis came to West Dallas, the mayor got a hold of us and said, "Can you come and work with us? You know, can you come and do a counter rally? You know, and get the positive message out." And even within that, there were 6 police departments that joined with the West Dallas Police Department and working in a positive way. They all worked with us in terms of what we wanted. We were even down to the point, because of the difficulty and the potential violence and people in the crowd, that was understood that if I did like this, did the circle, officers came, and all I had to do was point to somebody and they would remove them and talk to them rather than have violence. You know, that's a really strong relationship. But it's based upon being nonviolent, being democratic, and democratic, those are the 2 principles I work on, nonviolence and democracy. And so the relationships stem from not just being on the street, but working in City Hall. You know, during the Iraq War, we started a movement of referendums where you go to the polls, or city council resolutions to bring the troops home. I wrote the referendum for Milwaukee, and the people in Milwaukee went to vote on it. And 72% of the people in Milwaukee voted to bring our troops home. And what was important about that from the education end was I was getting 2 pages in the Milwaukee Journal where they wouldn't print otherwise, you know. It was important because people talked about it over lunch at work because they were going to go vote on it. People talk about it at their dinner tables or Thanksgiving, you know. And so the education process was huge. And here we're working the legislative process as a part of the tools. And so not only did we win that referendum in Milwaukee, but took it to 41 other cities in Wisconsin. And we won 48 of those, whether it was a city council resolution or people going to vote. That's huge in terms of education. But also and it's non-binding, but for a congressman or a senator to look at their state and say 48 cities said bring our troops home, that's important. And when you get 500 cities around the country saying the same thing, that's important. So we went from a focus group under Bush to a majority of this country being against war. And it took us 7-8 years. But we worked hard at that. And it curtailed. It's still a tragedy in terms of what's happening in Iraq. I'm asked to come back often. I see my friends who I worked with there. I see them around the world at World Social Forums. I was just with them in Montreal last summer at a World Social Forum. But it's just an ongoing struggle. When I was in Iraq, they got like 2 hours of electricity a day. That was 2004. 2017, they're getting 3 hours of electricity a day. And we put up billions of our tax money to fix that, and it isn't fixed yet. So, you know, the suffering that comes from war, the continual thing, you know, and you don't think about you as students. I mean, I visited the universities, the bombed out grade schools. Think about doing your homework by candlelight, you know, in the 21st century, you know. But it's all difficult. But we have these ongoing wars, and so it's a matter of how do we change these things. You know, we used to say that we'd go to war and we'd make money. Now it's like to make money we go to war. You know, when more than half of our taxes goes to militarism. And again, I'm not downing the military completely, but it's disproportionate. For one fighter jet that we make, just that one jet, for 20 years, college would be free for everybody in this country. Can you just imagine the money? It's unbelievable, you know. So you know it's a difficult situation, and at the same time, so many things are connected, and I see my job is making those connections, you know, and making the connections between climate. Making the connections about fossil fuels, making the connections between climate and militarism. You know, things are at a point where it's so difficult to turn it around, but at the same time, the U.S. military is the largest purchaser and consumer of fossil fuels on Earth. If you throw in the other militaries around the world, it is so, I mean, if we could change that part of our life, yeah. It's easy for me to ramble, and I don't want I want some sequence to this, and I appreciate your questions. But it kind of follows that trail, and it's kind of such a difficulty in terms of changing our government and the decision making. The night before the vote for preemptive attack on Iraq, we had Georgetown students survey every congressional office in Washington, the House of Representatives and the Senate. Survey them in terms of the public response to the potential war. It was 100 to 1 against war from the U.S. public, literally, in terms of the phone calls, the emails, the faxes, the petitions. And yet, only a few people in Congress voted against going to war. So it comes down to representation. It all also comes down to money and politics, and I'm going to be very honest about that, you know. So it's very difficult. It's a very difficult situation in terms of change, and at the same time, you know, the gap between the rich and the poor grows. And on the other end of war, you know, I've served homeless veterans for 27 years, and I still serve them. And I mean serving them by being out at night in the streets, by feeding hundreds at a time in downtown Milwaukee, by organizing more than 50 organizations, every veterans organization, every federal organization, every county organization that has anything to do with homelessness, and working on that end. And I'll tell you the stories. I mean, I'm sitting on a tank in Baghdad with our guys, and they're saying, well, we didn't buy into this, you know. I didn't expect all this. I'd rather be home with my wife and kids, you know. But it's kind of working toward getting a balance in our society. I was just last month down on the border with students from the Marquette Center for Peacemaking, and an effort that I've been involved with for 15 years about what's called the School of the Americas, and that jumped off in 1991 when 9 Jesuits were assassinated in South America. And that's become a huge movement, and I've been part of that movement. But also, when you make these connections, it's not only the border and the migration up, but what are the reasons for it, you know? And so I make the connection to climate. You know, South America, Mexico has had the worst drought in centuries. The worst drought in terms of farming and providing for their country. And then because of the climate crisis, the level of water coming from the mountains is less. So who is the water for? Is it for the rural indigenous farmers, or is it for big agriculture and mining? Is it for the cities or the rural areas? And so with the water decreasing because of the climate crisis, people come north to be able to send money back for their families because they don't have the same economics in their countries anymore. It's all complex with other things than the direct trades and lots of other stuff. But that's a basis for it. And it's climate. You know? And so you look at the denial about that, but you look at the realities. And so people are being displaced. But so I see my role as an educator is to make the connections between that border and the climate and the economics. You know, and it's not all this simple. And also to work against that wall. And there are sections where we don't have a wall, and it's intentional because it's the most horrid place that you could think of. And you walk in there, and all you do is walk across bones. Just bones. You know, and so that's a real important area to me. You know, it's been a real important area to a lot in the Catholic community, and so I'm always happy to see students from the university and the Center for Peacemaking at those kinds of reality events. Yeah, there's just so much there is, but they're so connected in so many ways. If we talk about militarism and talk about the police. You know, I led my political party, and I'm Green Party. And I'm proud to say it. I'm a national co-chair of our party. I've been a leader for 17 years in our party. And we had a rally in Ferguson, Missouri, across the street from the police station, along with the local activists there. And I put that together. And the new police chief there came out, and they were walking the crowd, and he sent one of his lieutenants over and said he wanted to talk to me afterwards. And I said that was just fine. And again, this is an area that I work in. I'm real studied in this area. And there was one of the young activists in Ferguson who was standing there at the time. And he told me, he said, you know, we don't meet with the police alone. It has to be public. And so I said, okay, he is coming with me and he'll film it. You know, I'm here to support him. That's why I'm here. And so we met with him later, and we met outside. That was one of the local tenants said that it has to be public. You can't do it alone because of such abuse. And this is a new black police chief. And he says to me, well, what do you think I do? First of all, I shook his hand, and he went to shake the young man's hand, and the young man didn't want to shake his hand. And I don't blame him. And we talk about that a little bit later on. But he asked me, because it was obviously that I knew what I was talking about in terms of police accountability. And he asked me, he said, well, what do you think I should do? And I told him, you've got a 200-page report from the Department of Justice telling you what you should do. And you know that. But I also told him, in my manner of humanism, there are things that you can control. You can't control the city council putting a quota on traffic tickets. You know, you can't control that. But you can control your men who you put on the street in the community. You can control that, you know? And I asked him if he was military. He said, yeah. And I said, probably 90% of your force. He said, yes. And I said, that's not bad. You know, but the issue of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorders, should be post-traumatic stress normalities of war. Back to that thing that war makes people do, the things they wouldn't do otherwise. You know, and I brought up the fact of PTSD, and that I've worked with veterans, that I buried 12 veterans one summer because of their PTSD and suicide. You know, I say the words. I'm with them in the emergency rooms when their bodies are jumping up and down with drugs. And I'm the one who gets called in on that. You know, and I said, well, you know, in terms of the mental health of your own police force, do you screen for PTSD and psychological problems, especially knowing that it's a majority experience coming in and coming back home? I said, do you check on that? Not only in terms of how they behave in the community, but also how they treat their wives and their children in terms of their mental illness, you know? And he's looking at me like, oh yeah, you know, and his lieutenants are like, makes some sense, yeah. Then I told him the story, you know, this is such a difficult situation with the community being split and violence like this. I told him the example of a new police chief in the Carolinas in a community about this big with similar problems. And he happened to be a black chief, but he also happened to be a religious man and a man of values. And he came in, and the first dictate he said to his police force is, if I ever hear of you calling somebody a name, calling them out of Mr. Smith, if I ever hear the N word or the B word, if I ever hear it, you're fired. In 2 months, community relationships changed tremendously by just getting back to basics, you know. And so things can be complex. And you know, when I'm talking to kindergarten kids about King and about the world, and I'll ask them, do you know the golden rule? And I said, well, most of us learned it from our grandmas. And it was, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. You can have all the rules and laws in the world, but if you deal with that basic tenet, everything's going to be okay. And so, you know, it comes back to trying to simplify things in terms of today. As I talk at high schools about diversity and about race, one of my favorite sound bites is, you know, back when I was young, we just had vanilla and chocolate ice cream. Now we got 31 flavors, you know, and everybody goes, yeah. No, but that's a value, yeah. And then also talking with students and having them come up with questions later on, and I just remember I was out in west of Milwaukee at this high school, and afterwards. And you were talking about race and diversity and all this stuff, and afterwards, the student comes up to me, girl, and says, you know, I can't deal with my parents. They hate my best friend because she's gay. You know, and they talk about her, and they don't want me to. She's my best friend. She's a good person, you know. And what do you suggest? And I told her, you know, you only get 2 parents in life. So you need to work with that. But you also need to stand up and tell the truth. And just be polite about that, but keep at it. And you might find their attitude would change over time. You know? So it's not like telling them off and running away. This is your life. But at the same time, you can help educate them by your own consistency. You know? So you know whether it's race or sex or other issues, whether it's economics, you know, there's the understanding and the talking through of things is so important. You know, that's taken it from the classroom to the world, and I've been so fortunate in terms of what I've been able to do as an international leader. And working with presidents of countries, you know, and I loved it when I was a fellow at Marquette University, and I would be working around the world, and I'd call back from Venezuela and talk to my students about President Hugo Chavez, or I'd be in New York and the UN is meeting, and former Prime Minister Ahmadinejad of Iran wanted to meet with us, you know, and I'd call back and talk about that, and talk about how he's a kind of a haughty guy looking down on you. I didn't like him, you know, and whatever. But that kind of reality in terms of getting around, you know, I've worked with the labor leaders of Great Britain. I've worked with the student revolutionaries in France, who were working working for minimum wage and fair wage for students. So I've worked with immigrants all over the world, literally, because people I just remember being at a European social forum, and my looks draw the camera. You know, when my dreads are down, I'm looking a whole lot different than other people, and so I pull the cameras, and people walk up to me and say, "Who are you? You somebody. You're important." And that I'm not saying that in terms of all that, but I'm saying that I have had enough experience to be able to communicate, and also to be able to feel. And you talk about communication. I have sat down with people, and we share no language, and we can sit for an hour and communicate, and not have a common language. It's just that we are people. You know, and again, we all want the same things. So it's a wonderful life. It's a tough life, and I'll be heading back to Greece. I was in Greece this April on an international panel, and this guy who was next to me said, "George, you don't remember me," and he was the leader of the Pakistani community in Greece, with a lot of outright violence toward them. He said, "You don't remember me?" He said, "But 5 years ago you were here, and we were in court, and you stood up for us, and that was so important." I said, "I don't even remember this, but the violence, the fascism, it's unbelievable over there, and this coming March 17th. We're working in Europe, and the UN has called for an International Day Against Racism, and I'm organizing across the country in terms of work against racism, and bringing the peace movement to work with Black Lives Matter on an event on that day around the country in their communities. And I think that's really important, because all of us have to cross our lines, have to get out of our towers. I have to get out of the towers of our issues and work and understand other issues and support other issues. So that's something that I'm working on right now, and I'll be going back to Europe for a couple weeks before then to do a speaking tour against racism.
Okay, so you say you've traveled 90 different places. What about Milwaukee always draws you back?
Oh, Milwaukee. I'll tell you, you grow up here. You can be in New York City and hear a car horn honk, and I'll turn because I think that somebody's honking for me. That's the way Milwaukee is. Milwaukee's a big little country town, and I love it. I love it. Not only the connections, but we've got our problems, and some of the most distinct racial and economic problems in the country. But at the same time, people are more friendly here. Outside of race, it's a clean city. I've organized 2 national conventions here for Peace Action nationally, which is the largest peace membership group in the country, and for the Green Party. And I don't know how many people over time have said, "I came back to Milwaukee because I liked it." I came back to Milwaukee after the convention, because they find this to be a very, very, very likable place aside from our problems, and it is that. I call it the Riviera of the Midwest. When you look at the Midwest and beaches, but we were ranked the 3rd. Bradford Beach was ranked the 3rd freshwater beach in the country. But I used to lifeguard there when I was in college. But that says something. It says something that the River West neighborhood was ranked as one of the best neighborhoods in the country for affordability of housing and integration. There's a lot of good things and there's a lot of bad things. But this is where I was raised. I spent time in Stamford, Connecticut, New York. I spent time in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Great spot. I can go back to visit, but this is where I like to be. One year, about a number of years ago, in terms of the Shepherd Express best of voting, they have the best restaurant, the best politician. I got over 90,000 votes as the best activist. And that says to me that my community supports me. You know, in this community for many years I did a Sunday morning international affairs show on foreign policy. I loved it. I did that through UWM. Absolutely loved it. You know, but my focus has been on foreign policy and bringing it back to domestic policy. So I'm very confident because of my upbringing. I'm very confident in terms of my education. I'm very confident because of sports. You know, I proudly wear my leather sweater. But yeah, so I can get out there and I can do things, and it's really humbling and honorable to feel the recognition that I get here at home. I can be in a grocery store, and a 80-year-old woman will come up and say, "I saw you on TV. You kicked ass." But to get the response from the average person, and also to be able to stand up and be heard, I look to my upbringings for that, and so I love Milwaukee. I get away, and I do 3-4 international trips a year. And I just spent a month in the Southwest, but it's good to be back home.
So, which organizations are you most proud of that you belong to currently?
Well, currently, and I'll tell you, every January, I look at what I do and what I do well, and I make that evaluation in terms of what I should continue to do or what I want to do otherwise. And so, aside from United for Peace and Justice, and I'm not active in that, but I'm active with a lot of folks there. I've been active in terms of nuclear disarmament with a group called Peace and the Planet. It's an international coalition of 20 countries. And within the movements, I ended up being the rah-rah guy, the cheerleader, pump it up. So this is an important group to me. Every 5 years, the United Nations has what they call the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review. And that's a review of the nuclear situation in the world, the countries that have nuclear weapons, the laws and regulations and otherwise resolutions to try to deter it. And so every 5 years we gather at the United Nations, and inside the United Nations, and meeting inside with groups from around the world and making testimony to the General Assembly. But then we also have rallies and marches outside the United Nations, and I'm the rally guy. I'm the guy who leads the cheers. I'm the guy who pumps it up. I'm the guy who helps get it together. And I've been doing that for 20 years now, in terms of the United Nations and that kind of work. And also the cross work in Japan and main allies and in France and Great Britain. And I do travel within that realm. One thing that's been very important in more recent years is the climate crisis. And one of my main venues of education have been the World Social Forums that I talked about earlier. And I've participated in World Social Forums in Porto Alegre, Brazil, in Belém, Brazil, on the top in the Amazon basin, in Caracas, in Greece, in Montreal, and a number of times in Tunisia. And I love Tunisia. Tunisia began the Arab Spring in terms of democracy efforts in Northern Africa. Tunisia was the only completely non-violent revolution, and it is the only democracy that's lasting. I've been there a couple times, and we have students that I worked with there, 5-6 years ago, and they're leaders in the country now. But it's such a sweet place. But within this getting around in the social forums, it comes back to that organizational stuff. And so, in that vein, I'm on the board of directors of the Liberty Tree Foundation. And we work internationally and nationally around issues of freedom. And for that board, I do my international education work. Okay, and so nationally. So it might be about trade agreements that are detrimental to the U.S. citizenry. It might be about the connections of militarism and climate. It might be just about climate. So my partner and I, we do this, and we're free to do this. And I do these presentations at universities. Georgetown is one of my favorite places. I lecture there every year. Marquette, UWM, wherever, and I'll go. And I'll go for free. You know, it's just like I can do this. You know, but the Liberty Tree Foundation is really important to me, and I use that for a platform. I'm just joining the board of Pace Bene. And Pace Bene is a Catholic organization based upon nonviolence and the principles of Jesus and King. And I'm just joining their board because of my experience in my work in terms of nonviolence training. And coming up this next midterm election, in terms of trying to shift the balance in Congress, there will be a lot of focus on that election. The midterms are when they elect Congress people. And so it's an opportunity to change some things within the Congress. And so there's planned a lot of nonviolent civil disobedience within the Catholic community and the broad community around that, and around politicians who have the wrong value and detrimental to the needs of the American people. So I'm just joining their board. I mentioned the Green Party, and people go, Green Party, well, what's the Green Party? Greenpeace, you know, is that environmental stuff? No. No, we were the third largest political party in this country. We are the fourth largest political party. There are only 4 major political parties in the country, and that's the Republicans, the Dems, the Libertarians, and the Greens. And I'm a national co-chair. And within that, my portfolio is the international work, the peace work, and the outreach work. And I love it. It takes up a lot of time, but that's important to me. Yeah, I'm a tree hugger. I grew up planting trees in northern Wisconsin when I was in grade school. I love it. But we also run candidates. But it's also about values. And you know, we had this election last year, which was unbelievable in terms of the presidential election. And I started writing about voting machines and black box voting and control by outside elements back in 2002. We got ripped off in Wisconsin. I led the presidential recount. We put up $4 million, 3,000 volunteers to recount the votes in Wisconsin. And the state would not let us into the computers. We still got 1.9 million up with the states to gain access to those voting machines. The voting machines in Wisconsin are outlawed in California because they're so tamperable, especially from the outside and the inside, you know. And so we didn't get access to those machines. You know, that was 6 months of my life in terms of after that election. And it came down to, we had 17,000 of our citizens whose votes weren't counted, were not counted at all, were misconstrued or otherwise. And then in the big counties and the urban populations where they're more machine-oriented, we really don't know what happened. If in the hand count areas it was 17,000, and that's half the state, we know there's at least another 17,000 in those bigger areas. In Brown County, which is Green Bay, we were able to, we documented this by film, we took the same stack of votes and ran it through the same machine 3 times with 3 different outcomes. And that's our democracy, you know. So that's something I'm going to continue to work in terms of voter justice and accountability, because everyone's vote should count, no matter what party you're from. And we weren't going to benefit from this, but at the same time, I'd worked in election work. I worked Ohio, and you know, for 2 presidential elections, just nonpartisan, get out the vote. You know, not as a party person, but the discrepancies, the political games, So the political game goes like this. Your name's George Martin, well, you're registered to vote in Minnesota, so you shouldn't be able to vote in Wisconsin, take you off the list. You know, something as simple as that. You know, there's so much manipulation there. So that's an area that I'm dedicated to continue to work in, and dedicated to take it county by county for a paper ballot, and a paper trail trace. You know, that's the only real way to have things done that's accountable when it comes to that kind of computers and programming. The machines in Wisconsin were darn near given free to the counties, and by a company on the other side of the border in Minnesota with 2 people. You know, and as citizens, we couldn't get into the machines with experts to see how they're working or not working. So that's a whole area, but that's an important area, and so, you know, that's an area that I'll continue to work in.
Thank you. That was a great interview.
Thank you.